Ladies and gentlemen, while our panellists are making their way up onto the stage, they've done so very quickly. Please don't forget to fill in those donation cards to ensure that you go into the draw for some very exciting prizes, including dinner for two at Lucioli. I am available for a +1 duty. A spa voucher from the Wellness Centre, Ulster chocolates and much more. So after our panel discussion this morning, we're going to draw some of the donation cards out of the barrel and you could win one of those prizes showcased over there. Don't know why I told you where they are, they might go missing. During the break, I was able to tap and go a donation using one of the Commonwealth Bank terminals, which our volunteers are using around the room. If you're lucky, you can make your donation using a new CommBank Albert terminal. Fun fact, it's named Albert after Albert Einstein because it's ingenious technology. I'd also like to mention a fantastic Shop and Support UN Women opportunity. This week only for International Women's Day, our partner Esprit will be donating 10% of sales off any item in store to UN Women, which is fantastic. So make sure you go and shop everything you need for the entire year before the 8th of March, both in store, Subiaco, Mele, I believe, and online. Last year, the proceeds to UN Women topped $78,000 from this, so it's a huge way you can have fun and support UN Women. So make sure you visit .com.au or visit your local Esprit store to take part. Now, I am delighted to introduce our three panellists to you. All of them share a passion for accelerating gender equality in diverse settings, along with a core belief that women should have access to the same opportunities as men. Please welcome former Premier of WA, Carmen Lawrence, currently a professorial fellow at UWA, Yassmin Abdel-Magied, founder of Youth Without Borders, and Mele Maualaivao, UN Women Country Program Coordinator from Samoa. We might start with you, Carmen. As the Minister assisting the Prime Minister for Women in 1995, you led the Australian Government delegation to Beijing. Can you tell us why this conference this year marks a historic moment in our history?
Well, obviously, 20 years later, it's important to see how far we've come and what still remains to be done. In 1995, we had some, I think we're having problems with the sound here. I know, it's coming and going. I think there are problems with a building site nearby. Is there anything I can do to help? Go to the microphone quickly.
Yeah, thanks, Carmen.
Sorry about that. Now we need to turn this on. 1995, Beijing. It was a very exciting time because it was an opportunity for us to reflect on the status of women with a huge number of organisations and governments represented. The governments were well habituated to, if you like, the sorts of discussions that were taking place there. The NGOs had a wonderful time, much more fun than we did, looking at the issues that we had to confront as a society, as a globe. The environment, poverty, the education of women and girls, employment, all of those issues remain with us today. One of the things I remember well, and I'll be brief on this because we're starting a little late, is that amongst our delegation in the non-government sector were two young women from Tibet. They were Australians by then. They had migrated, for obvious reasons, from Tibet, and they were being harassed by the Chinese officials. Fortunately, our ambassador intervened and protected them, but it stayed with me. And the protection of human rights remains, I think, a concern for all of us as we look around the globe today.
Thank you, Carmen. Is my microphone working? No?
Yeah, I think you'll have to go to the...
Mele, we might get you to...
Sorry, I'm just checking
microphones. All right, I'm going to throw that down. That's not working. Very smooth. Mele, do you want to come here and just speak about progress in the Pacific over the last 20 years since Beijing and what you think the opportunities are in the next 20 years?
Wow, that was very fast. I'm a bit taller than... but, well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I'll be succinct. Of course, we heard the numbers in terms of international statistics in terms of women and ending violence against or women and violence. So it's 1 in 3 in the world. When we come to the Pacific region, it's 2 in 3. So that number doubles. So the tables there, I see there are about 10 of you. That means 7 out of 10 women will experience domestic violence in their lifetime or some form of degradation, humiliation, and verbal abuse So the question is, how do we get involved? And part of that is what UN Women does. DFAT and UN Women support the Pacific Fund to End Violence Against Women. And this provides funding for small NGOs and governments, and these are grants between $10,000 and $100,000 US dollars, so that we can do grassroots implementation as well as legislative and policy implementation. So it's about making sure that all the different areas that need to be addressed are involved. And because of this, there's been a real sea change in the Pacific in terms of attitudes towards domestic violence and gender-based violence in general, because this discussion is being had. And 2 decades ago, this discussion would not have been had at such a large capacity and such a broad spectrum of people involved in the discussion. So those are some of the things that are moving forward. Of course, we have so much more to do, and Australia is not exempt from the numbers in terms of domestic violence. There, of course, have been some very public and very sad cases on your own shores. And so it's a reality that exists in this country as well, which means that when we talk regionally, we're not just talking about the Pacific Islands over there or those countries up north. We're talking about all of us in this region together. So collectively, that recognition makes a huge difference in terms of the way that you spend your dollars, because it's really changing attitudes everywhere. Is this microphone still on? Okay, sorry. Along with that is also political engagement. I've just come from Queensland, where I've met, the Premier. And so for the first time, we're starting to see, not only on your shores, but that really does influence the rest of the region. In the Solomon Islands, they had their elections in November, and they had their first female MP elected. And she is also the MP for rural development, which means that she will also go into rural communities and provide that type of female mentoring and role model that's so necessary, because it's not just about seeing leadership happen or gender equality happening in urban areas, but also in rural communities as well. Now, as you may know, in Samoa, we have our elections coming up in March in 2016, and we have a quota. So it mandates that 5 of the parliamentary seats will be to female candidates. This is very exciting if you intend to be running for office and you're a female, but by the same token, what UN Women does is we provide training so that the women who do run for office have the necessary tools and the knowledge to understand what political engagement means, having an understanding of strategy, knowing your platform, and also knowing your constituencies, right? Because it's not just a matter of running because you're female. It's running because you have the political will and you have the means to understand that. So that's really where we engage and make sure that we have the candidates and the skills that they need to move forward. Obviously, I'll be briefer than I usually am, and say that yes, we're definitely witnessing a sea change. So one of the most important things to think about when we talk about domestic violence is that we have family safety bills that have been made into laws in Solomon Islands, in Vanuatu, in Samoa, and we're in the process of doing that in other countries in the region. So we're seeing a real legislative recognition of the value of making this discussion not just personal, but absolutely public, and absolutely needs to be encouraged and implemented. And in Samoa, we now have a family court, which is a dedicated court specifically for domestic violence. The only other countries where this exists is Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji. So this is a trend that we can see in terms of how do we actually take judiciary, bring them into this entire conversation, and then let them be the nexus where the NGOs, where the people, where the police come together so that we can see direct implementation and we can see direct effect to the families that are involved. So on that note, positive note, I thank you very much and enjoy your breakfast.
Mele, I couldn't have scripted this better if I'd planned it, but you brought up a thorny issue of quotas, which always gets conversation going first thing in the morning. Now, it's been 20 years since Beijing and progress has been positive, but it probably hasn't been as quick as we would like to see if we do want to reach gender equality anytime soon. And that's provoked a lot of discussion that we do need to take bold steps and bold action. I'd love to get the other panellists, starting with you, Yassmin, to weigh in on whether you think quotas are what we need to introduce in Australia in politics and business.
Thanks. Thank you, Beth. And thanks for handing me the nice issue of quotas or targets or temporary special measures, as I know UN Women calls them. Look, I think it's interesting because I just turned 24, right? And so I was a couple of years old when the Beijing Declaration was signed. And so when I started work, I essentially thought the fight had been fought. You know, the work had been done, women were equal, you know, she'll be right. And it's actually, when you look at the hard data, it doesn't back it up. And I'm an engineer by trade, and I remember reading a speech made by a female engineer in actually the year that I was born. And the issues she was talking about exist today in the exact same form. And something she said that struck with me was, women have yet earned the right to be mediocre. We still have to be at the top of our game to prove that we're just as good as men. And there's an interesting song that's a little bit... this guy's just saying, I can underachieve my way into any college in the world because of his demographics. But putting that all aside, I think there's been really good legislative change, right? And I think that's important. But if we're to leave things to trend or to trickle as they're currently going, it's going to take us 170, 300 years to see any sort of equality. And I'm sorry, but I don't have that level of patience. And I think something that's really important is, with legislative change, you also need social and cultural change to back that up. And something that's been talked a lot about recently is this idea of unconscious bias. You know, we might think, women are leaders, but not necessarily when we think of a leader, who do we think of? Or when we think of an engineer, who do we think of? Or when we think with a person with authority, and women have this double bind of, do they be seen as competent, or are they seen as aggressive? Or if they're actually good at their job, are they likable? And dealing with these issues means that something has to change. I personally think there needs to be something that forces a change. And that's why I personally am a fan of the idea of targets. And I have a lot of female friends in the engineering space who are like, look, I don't want to be hired because I'm a female. I want to be hired on merit. But there's interesting research that shows that companies that actually say that they're hiring on merit actually hire more men in positions where they possibly could hire a female, because apparently merit is a masculine quality.
If I can add to that, when I was in politics in the Labor Party, we looked at the representation of women from our side of politics and judged that it would take 200 years to reach parity at the rate we were going. So we instituted quotas within the party, so that at each election a certain percentage, initially 35 and now 40, of the candidates in winnable seats have to be women, on the very simple ground that for politics there's no particular application that you can make, no particular qualifications. You have to be a good citizen. That means that at least 50% of our representatives should be women. So that with that aspiration in mind, we set targets, and they have largely been met. So that if you look now at the representation of Labor women around the country, they are up around 35 to 40%. It can't be left to chance in the case of politics. In other areas it's more complicated. But merit, as you say, is not a masculine condition. And clearly, we still carry around in our heads ideas about what women can and can't do that still act against the interests of women. And I think we have to attack some of those prejudices and biases directly and name them for what they are, not be afraid to say that, for instance, when the Berlin Philharmonic discovered that it had no women in its string section, that by having blind auditions suddenly, not knowing who was playing the violin behind the screen, the percentage of women went up dramatically and stayed up.
Mm. And that's a great example, Carmen. And I think one of the big discussions we'll be having this year in the gender equality space is that sort of unpicking of what merit actually means, and recognising that, you know, merit being an assessment of past performance but also an assessment of future potential is inherently subjective, whereas people use the word merit like it's this kind of proxy for objective assessment. So I think that's a really important point. I'm quite interested in the fact that, you know, we come together every International Women's Day and we have these discussions and everyone nods their head and smiles and you sort of think, yes, this is it, we're going to do it. But there's this ongoing gap between our commitments to gender equality and then our capacity to deliver outcomes like corporate targets for women in leadership, like the Beijing Declaration, like the Millennium Development Goals. And I'm quite interested, how do we ensure that there's accountability for targets? And Carmen, as a former Premier, I'd love to start with you from the sort of insider perspective and then maybe get some activist perspectives.
I'm not sure if people can hear at the back. I suspect that this is not working very well. Can someone indicate whether you can hear back there? You can, yes? Okay. Obviously, to have firm commitments is the first thing. And the Beijing conference in 1995 At Australia's initiative was a conference of commitments. It asked every government that was entered there to make commitments, to set goals, and to say how they would reach those goals. Now, in many cases, we haven't achieved those outcomes, but at least we were committed to action. Sometimes we have worthy aspirations in many of these occasions, which no one ever follows up on. First, you need the hard data. I've been going back through the speech that I made in '95, not because I'm an egotist, but because it said where Australia was at the time and what our goals should be, and looking at each of those areas to see how much progress we've made. In some cases, it's not possible to judge because the data are not available. In others, they're a bit depressing, and I won't take you through them this morning. But the wage gap in particular is worrying. The level of violence against women is worrying. So first of all, the data. Secondly, strong commitments in relation to those gaps that are identified, and strategies that might make a difference, not strategies that are focused on individuals. Typically, they don't work. They have to be social, they have to be community-wide, and many of them have to involve direct, if you like, talk to the community, so that you don't avoid discussing troublesome issues like violence, and you don't put it down to just a few families who happen to be having a few problems. That in fact, the problems are, I've lost sound again, the problems are society-wide. There must be some set of attitudes that is underpinning violence, for example, some set of structural arrangements. Maybe the way we work is part of the problem. Maybe the pressure we put ourselves under. We have to have governments prepared to respond to those sorts of questions as well, and to have conversations with their communities. But we also need activists in the community who keep the governments of the day accountable for their actions, who keep reminding them that this is a continuing problem, it's not a solved problem, as you perhaps thought as a young person.
I'll continue on for that, because obviously I'm on the ground. You know, I'm based in Samoa, so I have to look into the eyes of the women who potentially can benefit from our programs. And I also have to engage with the men in the communities. And oftentimes I'll have women say to me, oh, but we have women in leadership roles, so, you know, that box has been checked. And it's that type of potential passivity, thinking, oh, we've done this already, we don't have to worry, which when you're young seems perfectly okay. Yeah, she's right, mate, until she's not around. So that's what we have to think about. And when we look back, we can lament about what hasn't been accomplished in the last 2 decades. But as always, when you set goals, you don't hope they happen, you make them happen. So that involves commitment, and that also involves hard work. And it involves engaging in conversations like this, but with everyone in the community. So it's not just about making sure that it's legislative and policy, right? I am actually a complete supporter for quotas. But the reality is that you have to have those discussions with everybody who's involved. That's from the people who vote, to the people who run, to the people who lead. And if you're not having those discussions with everyone at the same time, you aren't on the same page. And so it's absolutely necessary that these discussions go beyond breakfast. So I hope when you go to your workplace, when you go home, when you go talk to the taxi driver, that you have these discussions and you do not feign or fear that you're going to be offending anyone, because what you will be doing is uplifting everyone. And that's the objective, right? Yes, sorry.
Thanks, Mele, for that great challenge to everyone in the audience to go and have those conversations. Yassmin, I'm really interested in your perspectives as a young activist in this space. What advice you can give for other people who might be inspired today as to what they might be able to go and do in terms of achieving gender equality in the community?
Ooh, tricky one. Look, I would challenge each and every person in this audience to do what they can individually. And so, I mean, I definitely think that there's a place for legislative change and there's a place for structural change. But if each and every one of us believe in the idea of gender equality, then each and every one of us has a role to play. And there are a couple of different ways we can do this, but something that I've been really encouraging the people around me to do is to mentor someone different. And that doesn't, and particularly for the men in the room, because I think in dealing with unconscious bias, we can think, oh, you know, that's not necessarily something that affects me personally. Or how can I deal with an issue that's so broad that I feel like an insignificant player in? But the fact is, each and every one of us are the individuals that make up the system. So if each and every one of us call out unconscious bias when we see it, or call out, or support each other in the sense that if you see a female at a meeting being talked over or her point not being recognised, call that out. Call out bias when you see it, and then continue to have this conversation every morning. Think about, okay, how am I going to approach a situation? Am I thinking of that person not as a leader because she's a female? Am I seeing her attitudes as bossy or crazy because she's a chick? Or am I being biased? Can I look at this a different way? And if each and every one of us make sure that we think about this on a daily basis. We have those conversations that Mele talked about. We talk about it with, I work with a lot of men that don't necessarily come to breakfasts like this. And I have these conversations, and most of the time they're like, Yassmin, you're crazy. But hopefully, by planting that seed in their mind, by saying to them, hey, do you want your daughter to live in a world where she's going to earn 19% less? Or that if she's successful, she'll earn 45% less than the guys around her? Are you okay with that? Asking those questions and sowing those seeds in the minds of everyone around you, and hopefully we can all be part of the system that creates change.
Thanks, Yassmin. Yasmin's on Q&A on Monday night, so I hope everything you say then will be met with rowdy applause as well. I am thrilled to see a growing number of men in the room and welcome the men in particular and encourage you next year to bring even more men, because gender equality is not something that women should be tasked to achieve by themselves, and UN Women is particularly passionate about this. In September last year, Emma Watson launched the He for She campaign, which was an action call to men to actually play a really active role in participating in the quest to achieve gender equality. On Tuesday this week, we launched the He for She campaign in Australia with Prime Minister Abbott and Opposition Leader Bill Shorten. So there is momentum building, and we do ask all men in the room to go to our website and take the pledge. On that note, I wondered if the panel could reflect on some of the best ways for men to participate in this space and to add their voices in a way that supports and encourages and advances the cause.
Okay, well, does this microphone? Sorry.
Just got to hold it right in front.
I'll just yell at everyone. Well, I'm going to use the F word now. I'm going to say feminist. And I'm going to tell you that the biggest feminist in my family happens to be my father. And the reason that is because he just happens to believe that women are equal to men. And he never paraded. He was a bit of a quiet personality. My mother, just surprising enough, was the outspoken one. But in every day, he believed this, and this was just his practice. So when there would be father-son events, guess who would have to come along? I would have to come along because I was just as good as a son. In fact, I was his daughter. And we would have to do things like going on fishing trips and stuff like that. And I remember saying to my father once, I said, Daddy, don't you wish you had a son so you could do this father-son stuff with him instead of me? Secretly hoping that I wouldn't have to go on the next fishing trip. And then he said to me, you know what? The only thing I wish is that I had a second daughter, because then we'd have more fish at the end of this trip. So this is what I mean. It was not something that at the end of the day, I realized my father was a feminist. Only once I had that vocabulary I did understand it, but it was lived in the way that we lived our lives. And that's really what we're asking. It's that, more than just taking on a label, more than just checking a box. Please remember, it's the way you raise your children. It's the way you engage with your colleagues. It's the way that you show the respect to the people who you actually admire. Gender is not a part of that. When you admire someone, it's for their qualities of who they are. So that's my message.
David Morrison, who's the head of the Australian Army, has a quote which is, the standard you accept is the standard that you walk past. And I think that's a really interesting way that men can reflect on in terms of the difference that they can make in this space. Carmen?
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing. I think, whatever occupation or position men have, then checking the effects of various decisions they make on the women in that organisation or more broadly is a first principle. First ask whether it is universally applicable or whether there might be problems created for the women who typically still have in our community additional responsibilities for children and for elderly and for frail relatives. To ask the question, is the decision that I'm making one that actually can accommodate the interests and needs of all the people in this workplace, and particularly with an eye on the needs and interests of women, or in our social group, or whatever it happens to be. So first, to be aware is perhaps the most important thing. And secondly, to join with women, because although I appreciate what you're saying about individual effort, that we should all in our various ways confront these questions, have the discussions and debates. Frankly, we're not going to achieve very much by that means. It's not a little pebble in a pond image. It does spread. But unless a lot of those pebbles get together and start throwing themselves against the windows and the doors to break down some of the prejudice and some of the barriers, as has happened in the past, feminism and the women's movement were important in shifting some of the attitudes in our communities. And I think women and men together need to challenge some of the structures that make it difficult. For For instance, the inadequate childcare in this country. We need men and women both, parents and grandparents, to stand side by side and say that is not good enough for our children, and not good enough for us to participate fully in the workforce. So working together to solve problems that particularly influence the status of women is something I think we can ask of our fathers, our brothers, our friends, and like you, I had a father of daughters who assumed as a matter of course that we were capable of doing anything that our brother was.
Thanks, and look, I'd like to echo both or what's already been said, but I think it's interesting to think about the current or accept the fact that where we are now is a result of historical context. So women have only really been in the workforce for, max 100 years in the way that we are at the moment, sort of fighting for equal opportunities. And so I think it is important to recognise that the structures that we're currently in are a result of the fact that people had very strong gender roles for a long period of time. And then thinking about what do we have to do to actually completely change the way we work, completely change the relationship between work and family, to allow both men and women to have equal involvement in both. And it's interesting, I was born in Sudan, and my mum talks about how in Sudan, a woman choosing work isn't actually as big of a deal because she has that support network. It's not about finding the money to pay for childcare because you live with your grandparents and your aunts, and everyone pitches in to bring up the child. And so there's a completely different way of thinking about how to balance work and life, or work and family. And so I think it is important to recognise that perhaps the way the sort of dichotomous way or the binary way that we think about work and family doesn't always have to be the way that it is at the moment. And I also think that it's important we recognise that there is social change that needs to happen, and that men are a huge... So I like to use the example of Malala's father, Malala Yousafzai, because I think as someone who grew up in a conservative Muslim family, I know that the example of Malala wouldn't have been possible if it hadn't been for the support of her father. So fathers, brothers, they all play a huge enabling role in saying to their daughters, hey, you can do this. If my dad wasn't an engineer and we hadn't, built things when I was 3 because he was like, Yassmin, you have to know how to change a tap, then I probably wouldn't have ended up being an engineer. And so I think it's important that men do play an active role, and just think about how can I enable the women around me to do the things that I would expect anyone to be able to do.
Okay, so in November last year, many of you will be aware that Australia and G20 leaders committed to closing the workforce participation gap between men and women 25% by 2025. So in Australia, what that means is currently 65% of women compared to 79% of men are in the workforce, and we're trying to close that gap by 25% by 2025. I just want to get the panel to reflect on how realistic is this target, and what action do we need in Australia to actually increase the number of women in the workforce?
All right. I'll go first. Well, I always use the example of Steve Jobs, and depending on your opinion of him, he was speaking at a convention in a country where women had to be separate from men, and there was a huge black curtain in between the two. And so the question was posed to him, this was about IT obviously, how do you see our development in terms of progress for IT in our nation, and in terms of being an international player? And he looked out at the audience and he said, how do you expect to develop if 50% of your assets, 50% of your innovation, and 50% of your workforce is unable to be recognized? You will never develop properly if you do not bring women into the equation, right? And that was quite obvious because he was looking at an audience where they had already been separated. So that type of palpable evidence is what everybody needs to recognize. But as we've said before, that means commitment, and that means hard work, and that means actually recognizing that you have to pull in that 50%. And this means development and success. And that's what most people are wanting to have, right? And along with that, that also means stability. So that's my point.
Can I just suggest, there are a number of, we've already talked a little bit about childcare and the realities of childcare and responsibility for children, particularly for those women of that age, of childbearing age, and for their partners, obviously, because it's a joint responsibility, although we sometimes overlook that. That there are other problems as well in relation to the way we work. If you look today at the number of hours that people put in, particularly as they're promoted and have more senior positions into their workplaces, they're punishingly high. And I think sometimes we have to ask the question, are we sharing the work well enough in our community? There are some people who don't have enough work and some people who have far too much. So we need to ask questions about the nature of the workforce. We also need to look at our cities. There's a wonderful report that's just come out from the Grattan Institute that looks at the fact that we're a very urban nation. For people who live in the inner cities, commuting's not a problem. But if you live in the outer suburbs, some people are spending up to 10 hours a week and longer getting to and from work. Now, just ask the question, if you've got children, how easy is that going to be? So there are these structural problems that we really have to address if we're serious about participation. It's not just about attitudes in the workplace, it's also about the real impediments that we face because of decisions that we're making thoughtlessly about the way people work, about how they get to and from work, about the capacity that they have as individuals to work from 7 in the morning till 7 at night and then care for families. It's not going to happen without destroying a whole lot of things. And I think that some of the violence that we see in our communities is the result of that enormous pent-up pressure that exists in a lot of our communities, and that we're not confronting the fact that there are some serious problems in our economy. The focus on growth, spreading out, commuting, these are things that are not favourable for the average human psyche. So we shouldn't kid ourselves. I've never wanted women to participate fully in the workforce if the workforce is the way it is today. I'd rather spend a bit more time with my family and friends than we're currently allowed to think is possible.
A plan is only as good as its implementation, right? So in the corporate world, if you have a goal and you set no plan or no milestones or no real structure and no real funding behind it, it only ever becomes this amorphous goal. So if we're really interested in closing the gap in the 25% by 2025, that's only 25% of the gap. So when in real terms we're talking about 3% or something quite small, really, of the number of women that we want to include. But I do think it's important that if we really are dedicated to this idea of gender equality or increasing the workforce participation, there has to be the funding behind it. There has to be the people that are going to be championing it, and also the impetus. And that comes from a lot of people having the conversation and a lot of people actually truly caring about it. So I think a plan is as only good as its implementation. And so we have to focus on how do we get each and every one of us, each and every one of our companies, each and every one of our governments dedicated to implementing it. If I said to a business that by having this special tool, you can increase your equity by 47%. Or if I said to a business, by doing a particular thing to your board, you can, have your return on investment or return increase by, an enormous percent. The numbers are there. The business case for diversity is there. But for some reason, we as a society haven't gotten over the fact that we have to share power.
Thanks, Yassmin. And this International Women's Day, UN Women Australia are actually calling for a comprehensive plan of how we're actually going to reach that target of closing that gap in workforce participation. And what we say is that this is such a significant issue, and we're realising that a few initiatives here and there aren't actually going to be the difference that gets us to close that gap. What we actually need is a multi-pronged approach, which is workplaces to review all of their policies and look at things like women in leadership and the pay gap and harassment and those sorts of barriers, the incentives and infrastructure that Carmen was talking about, and things like do tax incentives work to get women back into work, and what does childcare look like. But I think the third thing is that, pushing women into work or encouraging women or giving women the opportunity to enter the workforce is one thing, but unless we change those gender roles in society, all that's going to happen is we're going to end up with a bunch of very, very stressed out women who are carrying that incredible load. I want to get in a question on violence against women, and we're going to need some quite quick responses so we can do a few closing questions. But you will all have seen Australian of the Year Rosie Batty has been on this fantastic campaign over the last year and raised incredible amount of awareness of the extent of violence against women. I just want to ask our panel, 1 in 3 Australians, it's phenomenally high, it's stubbornly high despite interventions. What does it take to change attitudes and challenge behaviours in this space? And to some extent, is violence against women inevitable?
Okay, sorry. Well, obviously, when we're talking from a Pacific perspective, it's not just about the attitudes, it's about the value of women, right? It's their role. And it's the attitude that if you can beat a woman, she's expendable, right? So it comes down to that basic principle: is if you value this person, you will treat them with respect. But then how does that manifest when you have, say, in the Pacific, a multitude of cultures where they say, oh, because this is our cultural practice, we're allowed to do this? Well, the reality is that culture is in flux and it can change. So it's about having these discussions and making men understand that rather than just shaming them and saying you're the perpetrator, that they can actually be the champions, and that they can turn to their brothers and the other men in their community and say, I'll lead by showing how just I am in not being violent, right? So that's the question. But then we have examples where within the public, these stories become exotic, and people want to know more. And so it's a matter of also the public saying, oh, well, what are we actually going to do besides reading about these cases? What discussions will we be having in our schools? How will we be raising the boys in our community so that they understand that this is not just happening to those people over there or to this particular segment of the population, but this is something that can happen to any one of us? And what would you do in that scenario? So it really is about starting earlier and starting younger, so that these discussions are not just held at the adult level when we may have already been tainted with our unconscious biases, but that we are already engaging the youth and letting them understand what is right. And that's my point.
I mean, quite clearly you need a legislative framework to deal with this at the level of the people who are other perpetrators and support for the victims. But I take the point very deeply. We need to dig underneath this and ask, what is it about the attitudes that men have toward women, that we collectively have toward the use of violence to solve our problems, that leads to its expression in such a devastating way? And I don't think we have that conversation very often. We tend to locate it, again, in the individual and say, it's that man at this time that's a problem, instead of asking, why is it that so many families have experience of violence of this kind? And not just in relation to women, but children as well. Those people who are seen as, if you like, most powerless are the ones who are typically the victims of violence. And as a society, what are we saying to one another about that? What is the nature of the pressure and the circumstances in which we see this violence? We don't have a good understanding of those points. We don't really know well how it is that these events take place and what has contributed to them. And unless we do understand that better, it's more difficult to have the sort of education programs focused particularly on young men and young boys without understanding what it is that ultimately causes that trigger and the violent response to stress and pressure. So I just think we've got to grow up. It was only 20 years ago when we had a postcard campaign before the Beijing conference, and we asked women what they thought we should focus on, and domestic violence, violence against women, was number one of their concerns. So nothing has changed in a way in that 20 years. We still haven't had that conversation, although fewer men, when they're questioned, regard violence as an acceptable part of a relationship. There's still a worrying proportion who think it is okay.
1 in 3 is 3 women on every table. So it's absolutely not acceptable, and it's absolutely not inevitable. And I don't believe that culture is an excuse. And I definitely think that it's something that it comes back to being a human right. And I echo the point that we have to ask ourselves why. Why is it acceptable for people to be violent in their homes? And once we start dealing with that and being honest with ourselves and saying, actually, maybe it is about the fact that we fundamentally don't value women in our homes, that we fundamentally don't see the mothers as a valuable thing or a valuable person in creating a family, then we can start to look at, okay, how do we deal with this? And inculcating it in our young boys and young men and saying, actually, beating someone up is never a solution.
Thanks, Yassmin. And Yassmin, just as a final question, where do you hope we are 20 years from now?
I really hope we're not having the same conversation. In 20 years from now, I'd like to see a world where it's about equality of opportunity and equality of result. So I don't have to consider putting a different name on my resume because I'm worried that because it's a female, it'll be treated differently. Because I'm a female, I'll be seen as perhaps less competent, or perhaps have to think about choosing whether to have babies or whether to progress my career. I really hope that in 20 years' time, my daughter can consider anything and can be anything she wants to be. And it's something that people have been hoping for a long time, but I hope in 20 years we're actually there.
Carmen, I wanted to ask you, and thanks Yassmin, next week world leaders are again meeting in New York to review the progress that's been made before in the Beijing Platform for Action. What's your message to those leaders and what do we need from them now?
Well, I'm going to end, I guess, on a rather strange note. But I think if those leaders don't ask progress toward what, share in what, then they're not asking the right questions. We are sitting on the edge, I think, of some very serious problems as a globe. Climate change, the degradation of the environment, social conflict that arises from competition for resources. And we shouldn't be saying to women, just take a share of what's available. We want to change the quality of what's available. We need to rethink the way we do economics. We need to rethink the idea that this is a limitless planet, that we can keep exploiting the resources and polluting and shifting a species onto the death list at the rate we're doing, and have a world that is going to be worth living in. I don't want my grandson, I just have one, and his children to inherit a world that is not really worth living in, that creates more problems than it solves for the people on the planet. So I hope they'll ask, what kind of a world do we want women to participate in?
Thank you, Carmen. And Mele, I thought we would just finish with you telling us about a specific UN Women project in the Pacific that's really making a difference in advancing gender equality.
Okay, just checking, make sure. One of the things that UN Women funds is a program called Markets for Change. Now, this sort of brings together the issues of domestic violence, gender-based violence, and economic growth. In Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, and in PNG, markets are where most of the women earn their income, and that's about 75% of the stall vendors are women. But that also means that 75% of the vendors have cash, which means 75% of the vendors are vulnerable to crime. And that's not only theft, but it's also rape and sexual assault. So one of the things that we've done is that we have done infrastructural changes in the markets, depending what it is. You know, one of the places where women are often attacked is in the bathrooms because they're not that well lit. And so we've implemented building new bathrooms, building them in more prominent places. We've also done economic training for vendors so that they understand how to budget. And we've also implemented mobile banking. So you don't have the cash on you. You're no longer as vulnerable because you put that money into your telephone. But of course, what if you don't know how to use a telephone? So we also have to do an education program along with that to learn how to use a telephone. And that may mean you don't know how to read. So we have to then do an implementation project to make sure that you understand what these images are telling you about. So you can understand that it's multi-layered, but what it comes down to is that women are safer. Women have more money to spend because they can spend it on their children. They don't have to worry about it being stolen. And that more women are participating in the economic process. And because of that, they're actually having voices. So we're also having vendor associations being created by these women who have the means and the empowerment to be able to make decisions about the work environments that they come into. So that's something that's really wonderful, and this is where your dollars are going. So when I say I'm looking into the eyes of the women, I know exactly the names and the places that your dollars are going and the lives that they're improving. So that's something I hope will leave you on a positive note. Not strange at all, but something that gives you a reminder that you're affecting lives in really positive ways. And so beyond this discussion, just know that far shores there are women who are safer, richer, and more empowered because of what you're doing this morning. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mele, and to all our speakers. And I know we've barely scratched the surface of a lot of the issues that we could talk about this morning, but I understand some people do need to get to work at some point, purely so you can share what you learnt today and tell all of your friends about #IWD 2015 and UN Women and all of those wonderful things. Remember, if you do want a chance to win one of these amazing prizes, fill into your donation card, make a tap and go donation, or pay via CommBank's New Albert. Volunteers are circulating, and thank you for your very generous support. Can I please welcome Rob DeLuca, who is the Managing Director of Bank West, to give the vote of thanks. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you to the panel who I thought did an amazing job today. So put your hands together for the panel today. This event is a timely reminder of the importance of aiming for greater inclusion and gender equity. As someone who chairs our organisation's Diversity and Inclusion Council, I believe it is incumbent on all leaders to champion an inclusive culture and one that has diversity in leadership. Over the past 12 months, Bankwest has been awarded an Employer of Choice for gender equality, which I think is a great step forward from our perspective. And I believe flexibility in terms of working hours and location has been integral to achieving this, as well as the commitment to allowing flexibility for colleagues, whether they're balancing family and carer responsibilities or seeking educational opportunities. This approach allows organisations to hold on to talent and entice some of the very best minds, which fosters diversity of thought that brings improved performance, innovation and growth. While I think we've made some progress, I think we've still got a hell of a way to go, and we certainly heard that today. I join the other CEOs for gender equality here in Western Australia to focus on raising and progressing the issue of women in leadership. As part of the Commonwealth Bank, we're pleased to be a platinum partner with the Australian National Committee for UN Women, and trust this partnership helps raise the awareness for greater inclusion and gender equality. Thank you for coming along today. I hope you've taken something out from the session and certainly give generously to inspiring and supporting the projects of UN Women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. After hearing about the challenges faced by so many women around the world and hearing our panellists' personal commitment to change, now it's time for you to decide what your commitment will be to the next generation of women and girls. You can all fill in your details on the donation cards provided on your place settings or make your donations directly with our volunteers. Okay. At this point, we want to reflect on whether we're at school, in the home, in the boardroom, on the floor of Parliament, in the workplace or the community. Women and girls today do not have the same opportunities as men and boys. But together we can change that, starting now. To share with you the work of UN Women, I wanted to tell you a story about Anna. Anna had a small shop outside the market in Kiribati. But the little amount of money that she earned was squandered by her husband, who was looking for work and dipped into the tiny family purse every day to buy alcohol. Then Anna got pregnant. At first, the drinking slowed. Then, when they had their second child, they began to have marital problems once again. Her husband became jealous and started beating her. Anna's husband never beat her in front of anyone. He would take her to the bush and do it in private. 4 of these beatings were so severe, Anna was beaten to the brink of death. Only then, when a local health worker told her about supports available, did Anna know that she could seek help. Anna's husband is now in prison, and she has a newfound confidence to stand up for and support herself and her family. In communities like Anna's, all across the Pacific, women are facing violence and discrimination, and it is not uncommon for them to suffer in silence. With UN Women's support, Anna has had access to safe shelter, counselling and other supports. She's had access to justice through family violence laws that UN Women have advocated for. She's had access to police, health providers and teachers who've received UN Women to identify warning signs and to help women and girls escape violent situations. Anna also benefited from support groups of men and women using the media to promote changes in attitudes and behaviour about violence. UN Women's work can be hard to see and touch, but it is accelerating gender equality. UN Women meets immediate needs of women and girls while also tackling long-term changes to laws, policies and attitudes which perpetuate gender inequality. This work is critical to protecting women's lives now and into the future. Your investment in UN Women today can disrupt the cycle of gender inequality, just like it did for Anna. For example, a donation of $30 per month or a $360 annual gift can provide shelter, counselling and access to justice for a woman like Anna experiencing domestic violence. I challenge you to join me in signing up as a regular donor to UN Women. Your return on investment is demonstrated by the changed lives of daughters, sisters and mothers like Anna, who is now growing her small business and living a life free from violence. I would like to thank a few people before we draw the donation prize draw. This event would not have been possible without the support of our generous partners, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Commonwealth Bank, Horizon, PwC and Esprit, Cricket Australia and DHL. I'd also like to thank our media partners Marie Claire, the ABC and Isentia, our local supporter Mercure Hotels Perth, and pro bono photographer David Chong of Perth Photography. It takes passion and hard work to put this event together. I'd like to thank our International Women's Day Committee Chair Davina Hunter for ably leading a team of outstanding volunteers this morning. To the events team at the Centre for Social Impact and the Perth Convention Centre, thank you for your tireless efforts to coordinate today's event. And in closing, UN Women is helping women in 96 countries around the world access education, training and paid employment. Empowered women and girls who have equal access to education and work means more prosperous economies and a better future for us all. Now, it's nearly the time that you've been waiting for, the donation card draw, in 2 minutes' time. Our volunteers are just picking the winners on the side of the stage, and I will announce them in just a moment. But before I do, I would like to announce some very exciting news. In March of 2016, UN Women is very excited to host a Ride for Rights in Vietnam and Cambodia challenge. So men and women in this room are invited to take part in this bicycle challenge to experience firsthand how UN Women is impacting women, their families and communities. So if you're interested in becoming an advocate for gender equality, there's no better way to learn than cycling through Vietnam and Cambodia with us and visiting some of the incredible projects that are changing lives in the region. You need to commit to raising a minimum of $3,000 for UN Women over the next year and can participate in what is sure to be the experience of a lifetime. So if you are inspired by what you've heard today, please visit unwomen.org.au for more information. Registrations have just opened this week, so that's very exciting news. I'm just going to take 1 minute to confirm the winners of our donation card draw, and I'll be right back to close the breakfast. Thank you very much. Hi everyone, sorry to get your attention for one last time. We are a room full of winners, but today there are 3 winners in particular. The winner of first prize, a large hamper of prizes including a dinner voucher for 2 at Lucioli, a spa voucher for the Wellness Centre, organic body products, beauty vouchers, chocolate fondue. It's amazing, your weekend is planned. Thank you to all of those donors, Lucioli, Vivacious Living, Bathing Beauty, Beauty Hit in Como, Ulse Chocolates and Me Melts. The winner is Dr. Vicky Au. Vicky, if you can make your way over there, congratulations. The second prize, a cafe voucher at Lucioli, Feng Shui consultation, chocolate bars, handmade natural soy candles, This Little Pig Went to Market voucher, and a bottle of red wine. Thank you to all of the donors. Mr. Cameron Jones. Well done, Cameron. Your popularity is skyrocketing. And third prize, a mixed hamper donated by Elizabeth Ray, Councillor for the City of Stirling. Thank you, Councillor Ray. We have Miss Lena Del Barello. Congratulations to our prize winners, and thank you all today for your contributions. The contributions you've made today have an outstanding rate of return as demonstrated by our speakers. We look forward to reporting back to you on the fruits of your investment, and we hope that you share what you've learned today with your colleagues, family and friends. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day this morning and showing your support for International Women's Day. Happy International Women's Day.